On November 29, 1947, the 128th General Assembly of the United Nations opened in New York. The partition plan for Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, was on the day's agenda. For the resolution to pass, 2/3 of the 56 represented countries had to vote for it. Most of the Jewish Agency delegates had returned to Palestine, as no one believed the resolution would pass the vote. Abba Eban, the liaison officer to the United Nations Committee on Palestine, was the only one who decided to stay. He believed the situation could change. We took a map of the world, we cut it up, and we went for the delegations who were there. But in spite of all our efforts, we still needed 3 to 4 votes. We only had a few hours to change the situation. Telegrams went all over the world. Influential people were woken up at midnight for what seemed to be impossible missions. Everyone used their influence, great or small, in a desperate attempt to tip the scales in our favor, said Abba Eban. We knew that France wanted to abstain. I convinced Chaim Weizmann, the head of our delegation, to contact Léon Blum, Prime Minister of the Popular Front and Deputy Head of the French government in 1937 and 38. They had known each other for a while. He sent a telegram to Blum which ended with these words: "Can France abstain, be absent, at a moment that no one will forget and will be forever engraved in human memory?"
We will proceed the roll call. You all know how to vote. Those who are in favor will say yes, those who are against will say no. And the abstainers, always they know what to say. So we will start it now.
Alarmed by the rise of anti-Semitism throughout Europe and profoundly affected by the Dreyfus affair, the young Austro-Hungarian journalist Theodore Herzl published The Jewish State in 1896. In it he wrote, "If you want it, it doesn't have to be a dream. Just give us full autonomy over a sufficient piece of land that would meet the needs of our people, and we'll take care of the rest."
Herzl hoped that the moment the Jewish people had a country, they would be a people like any other, that everyone would treat them the same they treated any other people, and anti-Semitism would decrease bit by bit. But he also wrote that anti-Semitism was so deep, so entrenched for so long, that it was possible this hope would never come true. And he could see no other solution to anti-Semitism and exile but to create a state and live there.
A year later, the first Congress of the Zionist movement was held in Basel, with the goal of creating a home for the Jewish people. One of the participants remembers the meeting's conclusion. Theodore Herzl was the secular black-bearded Messiah who would lead us to the Promised Land. The excitement rose to engulf the public in the balcony. Throughout the room, you could hear people shouting, "Next year in Jerusalem." A year later, Herzl went to Egypt for the first and last time, then to Palestine. In his diary, he wrote, "Jerusalem is magnificent. The city of David in the moonlight is impressive."
It's a marvelous country he describes, of course. Herzl describes the country he imagined, a very liberal country, very European, very sophisticated, with excellent relations between the different communities and the different parts of society.
When Herzl presented his Zionist project, all the conservative, reformist Orthodox rabbis were against Zionism. This was the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, all of them.
They perceived it as a sin, arguing that the diaspora was a divine punishment, and only God could allow Jewish people to return to sacred land with the coming of the Messiah.
Herzl said, "You must separate religion from the state. We shouldn't let the rabbis lead us. They should stay in the synagogues, but they shouldn't tell us what to do."
Zionism represented the desire to be freed from the shackles of religion and create a new human and a new society in the country of Israel.
During the 7th International Zionist Congress in 1905, Palestine was chosen to establish a Jewish homeland after considering Uganda and Argentina. It was the first Congress after Herzl's death a year earlier. One of the members, Yitzhak Epstein, addressed the Tribune. We forgot one small detail. On that land we love, there is an entire nation that has been living on it for centuries and has never considered leaving it. We are making a serious psychological mistake. The president of the Union of British Synagogues had written to Herzl, "I tremble at the idea of founding a tiny, tiny Jewish state that would become a ghetto."
At the start of the century, the population consisted of tens of thousands of Jews and about 500,000 Arabs.
The Jews did not work the land. Most of them were ultra-Orthodox Jews who lived on foreign donations or were shopkeepers. They had small shops. That's it.
It was a small community, very religious, strong believers, many in Jerusalem or other places like Hebron and Safed. There was no difference between the Jews and the Arabs. In Jerusalem, for example, land and houses were sold all the time and were not an issue.
My parents, who were living in Jaffa, had many friends amongst the Jewish population of Mandate Palestine. These things at that time were natural. They were not anything unusual.
I don't think there's any reason to deny it. It's obvious that Jews had lived on this land, and that they had a culture here, that they had their roots here.
The pogroms in Russia increased the massive migration of Jewish people, especially to the United States. A handful of young Zionist students from Ukraine decided to settle in Palestine.
One group arrived, bought land in Rishon LeZion, and stayed there. One of the strangest things is that the Jews have said from the start that this is their land. And the Arabs hear that. In fact, the moment the first Jew came here, the Arab-Jewish conflict began.
From that viewpoint, the seeds of conflict were there right from the start.
Young idealists came to farm the land. They told themselves they would create an ideal settlement in Israel.
We have texts from 1907, 1908 that state, this situation is an enormous project to oust us from our own land.
The working conditions in this land, in places where they were far from everything, led them to create a way of living where everything was shared. And that way of living then led to the kibbutz concept.
The first kibbutz, a collectivist village, was established in Palestine in 1909. The founders were young idealists from Europe who wanted to create a new state by finding a new way of life.
My grandfather worked in the mud to help dry up the marshes. My grandmother broke rocks with a hammer. They lived under a tent for 5 years.
The rest of the world considered Palestine to be an abandoned, entirely uninhabited territory. It was a desolate country filled with deserts and marshes.
You know that famous saying, the bride was beautiful but was already married. But they just couldn't bring themselves to admit that. So they invented a slogan to justify and legitimize the project of their foreign community arriving to settle in the local population's homeland. And they told the whole world the famous slogan of a land without people for a people without a land. It was the worst lie.
They claimed they'd transformed this land into a paradise. Oh, you know, it was totally desert. It's a good thing we showed up. That story of a desert land dates from the 19th century. It dates from the time the European powers started to describe the sacred land as a devastated land that had to be brought back to life at any cost. The Muslims weren't mistrustful before the Zionists arrived. They never imagined that one day this relationship between Jews and Arabs would change into something that the Palestinians would pay so dearly. Jewish settlement is partly responsible for deteriorating relations between Arabs and Jews, given that the settlement had decided it wouldn't use local Arab labor.
Under the impetus of the Zionist movement, more and more Jewish people bought land in Palestine. Between 1908 and 1913, 11 new Jewish colonies were created. During this period, the first signs of Arab opposition to the Zionist movement appeared. Some Arabs protested against the sale of lands to Jewish people.
All the Palestinian Arabs sold property to the Jewish arrivals. There are deeds of sale.
Our relationship changed. People started to sense that there was a problem here.
How could an Arab live in peace with someone who comes and first of all buys land, but wants to create a Jewish country? Not Arab and Jewish, but a Jewish country.
Tensions rose bit by bit with the waves of immigration. When the Arabs sensed that the country was slipping from their hands.
World War I would upset geography in the Middle East. On the losers' side, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled by peace treaties. With the exception of Turkey, Asia Minor was now managed by Western powers. The Sykes-Picot secret agreement signed between France and Great Britain assigned Palestine to the British.
The British were responsible for making it possible for the Jewish people to have a state in Palestine, not to speak of the Balfour Declaration, which also promised the land to the Jews.
To guarantee a Western presence in the area, in November 1917, British Minister for Foreign Affairs Arthur James Balfour wrote an open letter to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, one of the Zionist movement's leaders. He wrote, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was the declaration of a colonialist offering someone else a gift that did not belong to them.
In 1917, just when the British government adopted the Zionist project in order to create a national country for the Jews in Palestine, Palestinians represented 98% of the population.
The most reliable figure was from 1919, when the English took possession of this area. For the first time, they conducted a very serious population census. In 1919, there were 700,000 Arabs and 70,000 Jews.
Right from the start, the British were sharply aware that in order to stay a long time, they had to divide this up. The first act of the division was absolutely perverse. In the first census, they created categories that didn't even exist. They created a Jewish category, and they created an Arab category. And it was always that. In other words, let's make them fight each other, and we will always be the referee.
With the rise of Arab nationalism, the first anti-Jewish protests started in March-April 1920 in Jerusalem, then May 1921 in Jaffa and Tel Aviv. Over 50 people were killed. Minister of Colonies Winston Churchill investigated the events. Early in 1922, he published a white paper to clarify the British stance on Palestine. In July 1922, the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to prepare the creation of a national Jewish home. Between 1924 and 1928, more than 60,000 Jewish people arrived in Palestine. On August 20th, 1929, protests broke out between Jews and Muslims over access to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. 2 days later, rumors circulated about an imminent Jewish attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Arab attacks against Jews started in the old city of Jerusalem before spreading throughout Palestine. 67 Jews, including women and children, were killed in Hebron. Other massacres took place in Safed, where 18 Jews were killed. During a week of protests, 133 Jews were killed by Arabs. A British report claimed, "These protests are local expressions of animosity and hostility by Arabs against Jews because of the Arabs' frustrated political and national hopes."
The Nazi Party rose to power in 1933 and started with the persecution of Jews in Germany, then in Austria.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler and his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, organized the boycott of all businesses owned by Jews. The Jewish Agency signed an agreement with the Third Reich's Minister of Economy, which allowed German Jews to emigrate to Palestine, provided they abandoned most of their possessions before leaving. The arrival of over 30,000 immigrants gave the economy a fresh boost. The immigrants were intellectuals, scientists, architects, and artists. Many companies were started. The population of Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, tripled and now counted 150,000 inhabitants. The beaches and fashionable places were crowded. Yesterday, a new elegant cafe opened on the corner of Allenby and Bialik streets, worthy of the great European capitals, wrote the magazine Haaretz. In 1935, David Ben-Gurion was elected president of the Jewish Agency. He had arrived in Palestine in 1906 when he was 20, from a small town close to Warsaw, to participate in creating the new state.
He wanted a country for Jews immediately. His friends understood that it was going to take time.
In the same year, he was named head of the Haganah, the armed group for the defense of Palestinian Jews, forbidden by the British. In April 1936, the Arabs called for a general strike throughout the country and demanded an end to immigration and the sale of land to Jews. The Palestinian Arab opposition culminated in the Great Revolt of 1936, protesting against both Zionism and the British presence in Palestine. Casualties from the riots were very high. Several hundred Arabs were killed by the British, and over 300 Jews also died. The Arab High Committee convened in October under the general leadership of Amin al-Hussein, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
The Mufti was the leader of the Palestinian people. He was a horrible man whose nationalism was pro-Nazi, not just because the Nazis were the enemies of the British and the Jews, but also because he sympathized with the Nazi ideology. It was total blindness. The Mufti's mad idea of throwing himself into Hitler's arms in Berlin.
The Mufti went to Berlin and attempted to create SS divisions, Muslim SS soldiers. He wanted to create a unit with the German army to come to Palestine and fight the Jews there. The Mufti didn't really have any authority in Germany. Hitler didn't care about the Mufti, but he linked up with Eichmann. Eichmann, early on in 1936, directed the Jewish department of the Gestapo in the SS. And he was sent here to learn about the enemy. In other words, to learn Hebrew, the traditions, and then return to Germany and know what he was confronting, so as to take care of it. They were obsessed with learning exactly what a Jew really was. Eichmann and the Mufti met together several times. Eichmann spoke of it and the Mufti wrote it in his memoirs. They had a common goal: get rid of the Jews.
For a long time afterwards, we paid the price for the Mufti of Jerusalem's crazy sidetracking.
The historian Haggai Horowitz would write, "When the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem met with Hitler, it was a sign that the national Arab movement's objectives had changed. For the first time, everyone was aware of the danger that threatened our existence. It was no longer imaginary. It was the blow that changed the nature of the conflict and our combat strategy." While Nazis proclaimed the Nuremberg laws and the lives of millions of Jews were threatened in Europe, the British blocked immigration routes to Palestine. For those who wanted to flee the Reich, there weren't many alternative choices, because other nations were also closing their doors to Jewish people. This was notably the case with the United States, where immigration quotas set by Congress radically reduced the number of refugees from Germany and Austria. In July 1938, the Evian Conference convened to discuss how to help the German Jews, but closed without reaching its objective. None of the 32 countries present would agree to open their borders to persecuted Jews. As war with Germany loomed, the British organized the St. James Conference in February 1939, hoping to avoid an Arab Axis alliance. The conference brought Jews and Arabs together for the first time, but the Arab delegates refused to sit with the Jewish Agency representatives. The British considered Palestine more than ever a ticking time bomb. They published the White Paper with policies considerably limiting the number of new immigrants and resolutely confirming that they had no intention of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Adolf Hitler had just invaded Poland. World War II had just begun. Palestine lived in constant threat of an invasion by Rommel's German forces who were on the African continent. Ben-Gurion declared, "We will help the British in the war as if there had not been a White Paper, and we will fight against the White Paper as if there is no war." The general staffs of the Haganah and the British Army agreed to create a force made up of Jews in the British Army, whose mission would be to fight the Nazi forces.
As a child, my father spoke 4 languages and had a very well-developed political conscience. His mother died just after the 1939 Nazi invasion. He then convinced his father that there was no other place for Jews except Israel. For 4 months, they traveled in a boat filled with illegal travelers, on board a boat that no country would allow it to dock at its ports. Neither the English nor Churchill, nor Roosevelt's America, nor any country in the world. A small 12-year-old Jewish child with nothing but the sea beneath his feet. Finally, they arrived here and the English arrested them.
People continue to arrive here, several thousand people, and everyone told stories. We thought the ghettos had been the worst possible thing, but we started to receive alarming information out of Poland. Hard, tragic news started to come in, serial murders in many places.
They didn't believe it. People at first could not even conceive of it. They thought of the pogroms and of anti-Semitism.
It seemed to be so horrible that it could not possibly be true. And bit by bit, at year's end, we started to get a harsh image of the events with appalling methods. People buried alive, parents forced to bury their children, and of course gunshot executions in front of the ditches. In 1942, a telegram arrived here saying that Himmler had decided to kill, by the end of the year, between 3.5 and 4 million people in suitable locations with a gas called hydrogen cyanide. That telegram seemed so improbable that it remained in a drawer. A first group arrived and traveled around saying, "That's what's happening, it's all true, it's terrible." They're doing it methodically. How could you hear such a thing when your entire family was living in Europe? It meant they had no more family, no more community.
World War II ended, but the Allied victory over Nazi Germany would not affect British policy. London still refused to allow escapees to emigrate to Palestine. At the same time, 100,000 European Jewish survivors had nowhere to go. A third of the worldwide Jewish population had been assassinated in the gas chambers and in Nazi camps.
It proved that the Zionists were right. A people without a country is a people that is led like beasts to the slaughterhouse. But also because the Holocaust survivors had nowhere else to go.
There were so many Jews looking for a place to settle. Doors to the United States were closed and locked. So even if the Holocaust hadn't happened, Jews would have come here, and in increasing numbers.
Palmach sent me to Europe after the Holocaust. And I met those who had survived, the remaining European Jews. It was an enormous shock for me when I arrived over there. One day, I joined some young adolescents who wanted to emigrate covertly, going through Italy and France. It was snowing. It was cold. I lived with them for an entire week. Every night, one of them would start screaming. They all had nightmares. It was such a shock. A terrible shock. It will stay with me for the rest of my life.
After the war, many survivors were distraught, disoriented. In fact, most of them were, because of how they had suffered terribly and the feeling they were now alone in the world.
People were experiencing such terrible trauma that no one was able to speak. No one could say what happened.
Most of these people had lost their entire family. When we met a family with 2 sets of grandparents, we asked ourselves, how is this possible? It sounded like the tales you would read in books. It could not possibly be true.
I was born in September '46 in a Jewish refugee camp in Austria, near the city of Linz. The first 2 years of my life, I spent them in those camps. I grew up there.
From 1945, Jews who had escaped from concentration camps were herded into DP camps, displaced persons camps, in Germany and Austria. Surrounded by barbed wire fences, treated insensitively by Allied soldiers, they did not want to return to the countries where their families had been assassinated. An American high official reported to President Truman, "The situation now is that we're treating the Jews like the Nazis did, except that we are not exterminating them."
The war was over, but the Holocaust was not. Because when the Jews started to return to Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania to go back to their homes, they found they had been occupied by other people, and they were killed. In Poland alone, about 2,000 Jews were killed between 1945 and 1946. People always refer to the Kielce pogrom, but it was only one pogrom among many. We left Poland in the summer of 1946, after the Kielce pogrom. We could have gone to the United States, but my mother said after the Holocaust we should go where Jews were living. We arrived on a Greek boat without authorization from the British government. We had been given fake papers, and the day we arrived, there was a curfew. My mother said, "Help, where have we landed? What kind of a place is this?"
With Operation Igloo, the British transported all the Jews trying to reach Palestine to Cyprus. In their personal notes, they referred to this deportation more sensitively as transferring and moving to avoid alluding to previous concentration camp deportations. The refugees arrived in the port of Haifa. The waiting British forces evacuated them and transferred them to Cyprus in cage boats. More than 50,000 Jews would go through these barbed wire enclosed camps guarded by armed military men. Most were Holocaust survivors. Philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote, "The internment camps in Cyprus were only possible because the entire world thought it more humane than Auschwitz."
If we look closely at all the decisions Great Britain made when they started blocking Jewish immigration, it wasn't because of fundamental political changes, it was because they knew they were being ousted.
In June 1946, the English began Operation Agatha. During a search, they found documents proving that the Jewish agency supported acts of sabotage. They decided to hit hard. 2,700 people were arrested. It was a heavy blow for the Zionists. 1 month later, the men of Lehi, a Jewish paramilitary group, blew up the King David Hotel, British headquarters, killing 91 people. Paradoxically, this universally condemned act would move events along and play in the Zionists' favor. The British understood they would soon no longer be able to control Jewish organizations which were increasingly better structured. Great Britain finally chose to retreat.
Bit by bit, the confrontations increased, up to 1947 when the situation completely degenerated.
Upon British request, the UN named an international investigation commission in April 1947. The final report recommended creating a Jewish and an Arab state. Surprised by this decision, Great Britain refused this suggestion of sharing. It declared it would abandon its rule in 6 months' time.
There was no doubt the Holocaust had influenced a large part of United Nations members, and that the UN mission that came here and saw the Jewish refugee camps in Europe decided, after all that had happened, the Jews should be given a country. What the Palestinian leadership didn't see in 1948 was that the Holocaust had taken place, and that the whole world was convinced that the victims deserved reparation. And that fundamental reparation for the victims was the emergence of a Jewish state, and that this was the only adequate solution to the Nazi barbarism.
While the commission was working, Mossad would attempt to force the British to open Palestine ports to Jews. It chartered an old boat named Exodus 1947 for the operation. The boat arrived outside of Haifa with 4,500 Jewish immigrants from Central Europe. Most of the passengers were Nazi death camp survivors. Rather than stagnate in displaced persons camps, they had opted to join the network of clandestine trips to Palestine. They thought they could finally set foot on the promised land. But the Royal Navy boarded and searched the vessel. In the confusion, 3 passengers were killed and 100 others wounded.
There were terrible clashes during the entire journey. We were expelled from Haifa and then sent back to France, then Hamburg.
This act shook world opinion. The British had to compromise with international opinion that favored resolving the Jewish problem as peacefully as possible. At the UN, delegations got ready to vote for Palestine's future. David Ben-Gurion listened to the first results on the radio with Eleanor Roosevelt, the former president's widow, beside him. She had been influential in engaging the United States in World War II and played a decisive role in creating the United Nations. France remained quiet about its intentions, but Léon Blum, moved by Chaim Weizmann's telegram, promised to use all his influence. President Truman pressured reluctant state representatives to vote in favor of partition. In return, the Philippines and Haiti would receive loans.
The majority were to vote against the partition plan, but the Americans used Thanksgiving as a pretext to postpone the vote. They then came back with the support of two small countries we couldn't even pinpoint on the world map, which the Americans had swayed during their national holiday, and the majority vote changed.
The Soviet Minister for Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, surprised the Western world with an unexpected pro-Zionist speech. During the last war, the Jewish people underwent incredible suffering. This explains why the Jews want to establish their own state, and it would be unjust to refuse them that right.
And Gromyko made a speech in which he presented himself as a Zionist. For years they pursued Zionists and locked them up in gulags.
Gromyko's speech had nothing to do with what was happening. Soviet diplomacy has never had a reputation for being sentimental.
Everything boils down to interests. The Soviet Union wanted to replace the British in the Middle East. It knew that the English would be forced out and wanted to be the first before the United States could steal their place.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. France, yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The majority vote we got during the decision on partition in November 1947, we never could have got it. And even then, it wasn't simple.
It is said that the United Nations decision ensued because the Westerners had a guilty conscience about the Holocaust. Excuse me, but where was your conscience before that? All of a sudden they had a guilty conscience.
It's one of the country's great paradoxes. It was founded after the worst tragedy in the history of the Jewish people.
The UN resolution proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and the other Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. But most Palestinian Arabs and all the Arab states rejected this plan and any division of Palestine.
Did the Palestinians make a mistake by not accepting partition? Does that suggest how fanatic they were practically from birth?
Opposing the UN vote on partitioning Palestine was a mistake for the Arabs.
Without a doubt, in retrospect, we can say today that it was a mistake, and not just what had happened in 1947.
But from their viewpoint, it wasn't a mistake. They weren't at all ready to accept a Jewish country. To live next to a Jewish country? Certainly not.
All of Israel's attempts to split into two countries failed because of the Palestinians.
They simply didn't see why they should give up half of their homeland. They couldn't comprehend it. Why? If the Arabs had said yes at that moment, would things really have been headed towards a better situation or not? Would the Israelis or the Jews have really accepted those things?
The day of the UN declaration, I was very young and already asleep. I remember my mother came in to wake me up, so I would remember the day the State of Israel was created. She said, they gave a state to the Jews.
David Ben-Gurion didn't hide his concerns from Shimon Peres, in charge of purchasing weapons. Today the people are dancing, but tomorrow blood will flow. I thought he was exaggerating, but the party ended and indeed blood did begin to flow.
My father used to say to me that the day the vote would be recognized and announced, a war was sure to follow.
Israel was born in war. People danced all night on November the 29th. And the last dances, the next morning, saw the first ones killed.
We were told, return quickly to Tel Aviv. There are already some dead in Ramleh.
The First War started with partition, a war between the Haganah and the Palestinians, which was in fact the first in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What happened was the Palestinians did not accept the decision, and they started a war.
The Arabs launched terrorist attacks. Bombs exploded in cities and roads were mined. In Jerusalem, a triple-pronged car bomb attack targeted the offices of the Palestinian Post, the Ben Yehuda Road Market, and the Jewish agency offices. 100 Jews were killed. In Haifa, members of Irgun, the paramilitary organization that broke away from the Haganah, threw 2 bombs into a group of Arab workers, killing 6 of them. In retaliation, the angry crowd killed 39 Jews before British soldiers could re-establish order. The Dalet Plan was developed in March 1948. It gave Haganah the responsibility for keeping order and authorized it to start expelling Palestinians. Ben-Gurion planned to implement the plan around May the 15th, when the British would leave. But due to the military reality on the ground, the Haganah went on the offensive and put the plan into action almost straight away in April.
The Haganah did all they could to pressure them, to scare them so that they would leave. With gunshots in the night and jeeps or vehicles passing, they got scared.
The question of evacuating places and settling in replacements constantly came up. So there was already a very clear policy in action. We also have all the operational plans carried out by the military units and the Jewish army, which was the Haganah back then, and they were all aimed at evacuating land.
When my parents got here, they were offered some housing, a house in Jerusalem that belonged to Palestinians who had fled. And both of them turned it down. They found it bizarre. They said, "We ourselves are refugees too. How could we take someone else's house?"
Several killings took place to make people understand that if they didn't leave, they faced death. However, if they left, their lives would be spared.
Remember that Deir Yassin happened in March 48 and would cause a panic.
Deir Yassin was a small Arab village of 600 people located 5 kilometers from Jerusalem. It had no strategic importance and was not one of the villages targeted for takeover. Yet in spite of Haganah leader reticence, the Irgun and Lehi, 2 paramilitary groups, attacked the village on the morning of April the 9th. But the operation was ill-prepared, and the Palestinians surprised them with their resistance, killing 5, including several officers. The Irgun and Lehi men then took houses one by one, blowing up several of them. There were nearly 200 victims in the massacre.
They created conditions and planned operations calculated to scare people and make them flee. As well as the murders and the massacres they did, like in the village of Deir Yassin. In other villages and cities, like in Lod, people had fled, looking for protection, to stay alive.
About Deir Yassin, everybody heard about Deir Yassin, and everybody's mind began to be that if we stay and we have these Jewish forces come, they will also massacre us as they did in Deir Yassin, so we better not stay and get massacred.
People were terrorized at the rumors of Deir Yassin. People were convinced Zionists would come to kill us all. We know very well Zionists had never had that intention, but to make the largest number of people flee, that, yes.
Deir Yassin was early on, and it was used as a psychological warfare in convincing many more Arabs and frightening many more Arabs into fleeing their homes.
In the memoirs of the first American ambassador to Israel, information about Deir Yassin was still fresh. In a conversation he had with Weizmann, the pacifist, he said the killings were unnecessary. Weizmann pronounced this spine-chilling phrase. This massacre has been a miraculous simplification of Israel's tasks. It has convinced the most stubborn among them to leave.
They taught our children that, well, it's sad that they died, but it's not that important. What's important is that we have a country.
On May the 14th, 1948, a jubilant crowd marched through Tel Aviv bearing flags adorned with the Star of David. In Tel Aviv, because Jerusalem was surrounded and inaccessible, Ben-Gurion stood under a portrait of Theodore Herzl and announced in a firm voice, "We proclaim the founding of the Jewish state, which will be called Israel. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness. There is enough room in this country for us and the Arabs." The State of Israel was born. The dream had become reality. But the High Arab Council immediately declared, "Arabs solemnly declare before God and history that they will never submit to such a power coming to Palestine to impose partition." Great Britain's tenure officially came to an end, and their troops went home. The British commander gave back command of Palestinian lands to Zionist leaders.
I was so excited that I couldn't sleep for several nights. Tel Aviv, minus the English. They had left the country, but they left the Arabs many weapons. The English were anti-Zionists from the start. They didn't believe that Israel, which was born in blood, could stand up to all the Arab armies.
Most diplomats and world leaders, and even some of the Zionist leaders here, had serious doubts that the new state could hold up against attacks from Arab armies.
Armies from neighboring Arab states invaded the areas of the old Palestinian Mandate. The first Arab-Israeli war had started. Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv. Less than 3 years after liberation from concentration camps, the great majority of Jews felt they were continuing their fight to survive.
It's true that declaring war when you're not even ready is indeed a mistake.
It should be remembered that it was the Arab side who started the war and lost. Should Israel have behaved in a better way? Yes.
There were constant announcements. If you leave by the Haifa coastal route, which is what we did, you won't risk your life. You can escape easily.
They were put into trucks. Between Haifa and Tel Aviv, nearly all the inhabitants of the villages were expelled.
People felt endangered and didn't feel safe to stay. And they all thought, as was the case with my parents in Jaffa, that they would leave and be safe, as people do in wars, and then after the war is over, they will be able to return, but they will never able to return.
My father made sure my mother and I were evacuated a few weeks earlier in a truck full of women and children who they literally dumped at the South Lebanese border. When the town fell, my father and sister went to the port and got on one of the last boats sailing out, which they were lucky to get on. And that's how they arrived in exile in Lebanon, crossing the sea.
Someone who lived through the Nakba told me, when leaving, we found boats that were waiting for us to leave on the beaches of Jaffa. Did those boats come by themselves? No, it wasn't just chance. Those boats were made ready to force people to flee or emigrate.
People didn't leave by themselves. No one leaves their house, their fields, their land voluntarily. In times of war, people are afraid, and they flee. They hope that when the war is over, they will come back, especially farmers, back to their land, in their houses.
The Arab leader said to them, Leave. We will win, and you can come back later. We'll get our property and our land back because we will win.
Someone who flees their home has no right to come back to it. The crime was not letting them come back. During wartime, people flee. They move. All kinds of things happen. But why did we shoot at them when they tried to come back?
In July, a few months after the establishment of the Israeli state, which was in May, in July, at gunpoint, people were forced out of their homes.
Nearly 750,000 Palestinians had been expelled before, during, and after 1948.
Following a series of operations interspersed by truces, the Israeli military forces were winning on all fronts, except for Jerusalem, which was split in half by the armistice line, leaving the old town to the Arabs. The Jewish population was chased out by the Jordanian forces. The West Bank was annexed by the Kingdom of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt. Palestine disappeared from official maps. By winning the war, Israel conquered 26% more territory than the partition plan provided for, taking control of 81% of Palestine in 1947.
After the war, Israel would settle on the lands it had conquered. Part of these lands was state land, but another part were lands from Arab villages which were nationalized. I can't ignore it, it's a fact of history.
10% of the Palestinians' lands were purchased up to 1947. Only 10%. Barely 10%. The rest of the land was annexed, seized after 1948, after the war.
Out of the 900,000 Palestinian Arabs living in territories now controlled by Israel, nearly 750,000 left during the War of 1948. Only 150,000 Palestinians were left, subject to Israeli military administration. The international community carefully ignored the refugees as they drifted with no place to go.
Add to that in 1948, there were millions of displaced people all over Europe. So, 800,000 Palestinians, or natives as we were called back then. Where's the problem?
على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة. رائحة الخبز في الفجر. تعويذة امرأة للرجال. غيم يقلد سربا من الكائنات. على هذه الأرض سيدة الأرض أم البدايات أم النهايات. كانت تسمى فلسطين. صارت تسمى فلسطين. فلسطين.